One other debate that I thought would be good to touch on is so given this base of naturalism and then moral sentimentalism, which you just described, can you sketch the debate about moral realism and where Nietzsche falls in and his opposition to Platonists about morality, since divine command theory is, as you pointed out, not credible already by that point?
For purposes here, we can take moral realism to be the view, right? That there are facts about what's morally right and wrong that do not depend on what we believe is morally right and wrong, about what our sentiments or attitudes are about what's right and wrong. They are completely independent of us, right? And we can try to discover them, and maybe we'll get lucky and discover them, right? But even if we discover them, they're still independent of us, right? So if slavery is morally wrong, it doesn't depend on what we happen to think about slavery. It doesn't even depend on what we might think about slavery in 200 years or 500 years, right? It was always morally wrong. You know? That would be the moral realist view. The anti-realist view denies that. The anti-realist view says that there are no facts about what's morally right and wrong that are independent of human judgment or attitude. You know? There are different versions of these kind of, anti-realism. One of the most infamous ones is the one associated with Protagoras, right? Whereas Protagoras says, man is the measure of all things. And in one version, that means what's morally right and wrong for me is what's morally right and wrong for me. What's morally right and wrong for you is morally right and wrong for you. But my subjective responses determine right and wrongness. Your subjective responses determine right and wrongness for you. A more plausible version that was certainly popular in antiquity and that Plato hated. Plato is the great enemy of moral anti-realism. Was the sort of communal version, right? There's what's right and wrong for the Greeks, and there's what's right and wrong for the Egyptians. And it's relative to the community. But what's right and wrong depends on a kind of communal consensus about these things. There's a slightly tricky, nuanced issue here in talking about moral realism and anti-realism in the early 21st century, which is that starting in the early 20th century, philosophers got very interested not in what I would call the metaphysical question. That is, are there moral truths that exist in the world independent of what we think about them? They got interested in a semantic question. That is, what's the meaning of the moral language we use when we're talking about moral questions? And moral realism is often conjoined with a semantic view that's generally called cognitivism, which says that when we say slavery is wrong, grammatically that just looks exactly like Brian's desk is brown. You can't see my desk. Your sofa is brown. Is it brown? Okay. The sofa is brown, slavery is wrong, right? We predicate something of a subject, right? The sofa is brown is in fact true because your sofa is in fact brown, if I'm not being misled here by the lighting. And cognitivists say same thing with moral judgments, right? They represent features of the world, and they are either true or false depending upon what the world is like. Since the moral realist says slavery is wrong independent of what we think about it, the judgment slavery is wrong turns out to be true. Okay. There are views about the meaning of moral language that often are called non-cognitivist or expressivist views, in which we should think of moral judgments not as trying to represent what the world is like, but trying to express certain feelings or attitudes that we have. Nietzsche no doubt says some things that sound like expressivism, but the point I want to emphasize is he wasn't thinking about the question, what's the meaning of moral language? Right? Nobody was really thinking about that question prior to the 20th century. What he's thinking about is the question that everyone all the way back to the pre-Socratics and Plato were thinking about, which is there an objectively true morality? Right? That would be the moral realist position for our purposes. Or is there no objectively true morality? Is what's morally right and wrong fundamentally dependent on the individual, the community, or something like that? Okay? Everybody in the history of philosophy has a view on that. Right? The pre-Socratic philosophers tended towards moral anti-realism. Plato, was the first and the most famous moral realist. Plato had a particular metaphysical picture. You don't need to agree with his whole metaphysical picture to nonetheless realize he was, the first and most important moral realist. The philosophers we know as the sophists were generally moral anti-realists. Nietzsche is much more sympathetic to the sophists. As he points out, Plato succeeded in defaming the sophists for history, right? Because sophist now has a pejorative connotation. It did not at the time. That is, the sophists were philosophers who defended certain views, including anti-realist views about morality. Okay? Nietzsche is on the side of moral anti-realism. I have a particularly radical view about this, but I do actually think it's Nietzsche's view, which is I think he's an anti-realist about all value judgments, not just moral value judgments. But again, I think for the sake of not spending the next 6 hours here, I probably shouldn't do that. Let's just focus on morality. But realism about morality fits with the project of giving a naturalistic explanation of morality. Right? There are no objective moral truths. There are things that people's, cultures, communities take to be moral truths, and now we need to explain why. Because it's not because they're discovering the moral truths that exist out there in the world. Something else is going on, and that's what we need to explain.
Well, actually, though, just to defend your belief that Nietzsche is an anti-realist about all value, I do have some quotes lined up serendipitously. So in The Gay Science, you write, Nietzsche observes, whatever has value in our world now does not have value in itself according to its nature. Nature is always valueless, but has been given value at some time as a present, and it was we who gave and bestowed it. So that sounds pretty much textbook value anti-realist to me.
I agree with that. Some people will point out there's a context in which he's saying this that complicates the picture a little, but in a way that I think is totally consistent with the value anti-realism, right? Nature is valueless, right? We are the ones. Now, the complication is Nietzsche doesn't think everybody necessarily gives values. He thinks, in that passage, he's talking about poets, right? Some certain important figures in the history of culture give a lot of values, right? And this goes back to what I said earlier, which is Nietzsche thinks genuine philosophers are creators of values, which raises the question, who's actually a genuine philosopher? He told us Kant and Hegel aren't. They're just great philosophical laborers. Who's a genuine philosopher? I take it Nietzsche thinks Plato is. I take it he thinks that Plato creates a set of values that, with the help of Christianity, take over the world. Right? Another one of his funny jokes is Christianity is Platonism for the people. Right? Christianity takes over the moral metaphysics. It takes over Plato's moral realism. It takes over one of the central ideas in Plato and Socrates, namely that you can't lead a good life without knowledge of the truth, right? That you've got to have correct knowledge of things in order to live well, right? And in Christianity, that becomes the truth shall set you free, right? Truth is very important to the Christian tradition. Again, Nietzsche thinks it's taken over from Plato. We could talk about differences between Plato and Christianity. They would have been obvious enough to Nietzsche since his father was a Lutheran pastor. His grandfathers were both Lutheran pastors. He was almost going to become one himself. He knew his Christianity and he knew his Plato. So Plato is someone who creates value, I think, in Nietzsche's sense, right? And then through Christianity, it becomes the values that permeate our culture and that are largely taken for granted. This is what morality is, right? This is the only way to think about what's right and wrong, good and bad, worthwhile, not worthwhile, and so on.
Well, I will read one more quote just to capture this moral anti-realism before we move on. And this one's from Thus Spake Zarathustra. And it also, I think, epitomizes some of his style. But Nietzsche writes, "Verily, men gave themselves all their good and evil. Verily, they did not take it, they did not find it, nor did it come to them as a voice from heaven." So naturalism there. "Only man placed value in things to preserve himself. He alone created a meaning for things, a human meaning. Thus he calls himself man, which means the esteemer."
Yeah, so. Good. That's a very apt quote. The interesting thing is the idea that Nietzsche is a moral anti-realist and a general value anti-realist is an extremely common view, except in some of the recent Anglophone, English-speaking secondary literature of Nietzsche, where there's a lot of people who are desperate to say, no, 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 Nietzsche really thinks there's some objective values or something. I think Max Weber, the great German sociologist, basically read Nietzsche correctly like everybody else. Rudolf Carnap read Nietzsche this way. Rudolf Carnap, the great logical positivist philosopher in the 20th century, was actually a very big fan of Nietzsche because he thought that Nietzsche was a value anti-realist, and that when Nietzsche expressed values, he didn't pretend they were objectively true. He used literary devices to express them. That's Zarathustra. And then, as Carnap says, the rest of Nietzsche's corpus is devoted to a kind of naturalistic, empirical explanation of morality, right? A kind of physiology, psychology, anthropology, account of how people came to believe in these kinds of values. And, from Carnap's point of view, Carnap was a moral anti-realist, certainly. Not clear he was a general value anti-realist. That's more complicated. There's certainly a moral anti-realist. That seems like the right way to do it. Much preferable to Hegel and Kant for Carnap. That's a little aside for the benefit of your listeners who know about Carnap. This occurs in the same essay where Carnap ridicules Heidegger, sentence the nothing nothings, and, says it's just, Heidegger's just talking nonsense. But what people often don't know is that essay concludes with a great deal of praise for Nietzsche as an exception to 200 years of embarrassing German philosophy.